Well, hello, I'm Douglas Johnson, and welcome to Day Tripping. Today, we're going to be talking about the history of the civil defense system in Los Angeles. That's the system that put up all those air raid sirens that I've been going around and looking at. And man, there are so many sirens in Los Angeles. I had no idea how many sirens there were until I started doing this walk. And yeah, I think I've only seen like 40 of them. So I have a lot more sirens to go take a look at. But I got to tell you, since I've started doing this, I have learned so much about these sirens, and I have to thank you, all the people that commented on my previous videos and gave me all the different information about the names of the sirens that I probably got wrong. I'm getting better at knowing the different names. How much power the sirens were, what they would have sounded like, where I can find different ones, because the majority of the ones that I'm seeing out there are the SD10s and some Model 7 5s and a couple of 500s. But there are other sirens out there, and I have a list of them now, and I will go out and look for those as soon as I can start getting out there again. So anyway, today, the topic of today is going to be the history of the civil defense system in Los Angeles and where the installation of all these sirens started. And, you know, it's got its root in World War II. As we know, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. It was a surprise attack, and people started freaking out. And there was a real fear that the Japanese would cross the rest of the Pacific and attack the mainland USA. And they needed to have some sort of a warning system so that people could know if these attacks were coming, and they could go to a shelter, just as they had been doing in Europe for the past couple of years. Again, if we're familiar with our history, we know that at this time, the Germans had been bombing London with the Blitz. So those sirens and the attack alerts, you know, these were really real life or death situations in London. And there was a fear that it would be the same here in the United States. So shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, an order was put in for multiple sirens to be placed on traffic lights and on buildings around Los Angeles. So I got all this information. Most of the information I'll be giving here is from an April 7th, 2007 article in the Los Angeles Times. I did a bunch of research on this, and all of the information seems to kind of relate to this article. So anyway, right after World War II, it was an order, according to the article, according to my research, an order was put in for 100 1.5 horsepower sirens and 45 1/4 horsepower sirens or signals. There was also 37.5 horsepower alarms and 27, excuse me, 27 3 horsepower sirens. The total cost for all of this would have been, at the time, $47,000. I went on, I did the math. It's about $863,000 today is what it would have cost to put in all those sirens. From the research I did, they don't talk about the specific sirens in this statement, but from what I could see, the half horsepower sirens would have been probably a Model A, and I'm basing that off of this photo right here, where you see this guy standing with this Model A. And then this photo right here, where you see the siren on top of the traffic light. If you look at them and you look at a Model A, they're very similar. And the Model A was done around that time. So I'm sure if I'm wrong, you'll let me know. And I love that you do, because I love learning new things. And the best way to learn something is to get it wrong and have somebody tell you why, so that you it kind of sticks that way. So yeah, so getting things wrong is a perfectly fine way to learn. And yeah, but I think it's a Model A. Let me know. So also the 7.5 horsepower alarms, again, I think those were Model 7s here. And we can see from these two women standing next to the siren that it looks like what would be either a Model 5 or a Model 7. And from what I understand, the 7 is just a larger, more powerful version of a Model 5, or a Model 5 is a less powerful version of a Model 7. They was typically, from what the website said, they were typically named based off of the horsepower. So the Model 5 would have been a 5 horsepower siren, and the 7 would have been like a 7.5 horsepower siren. But later on, those names became interchanged, and I think they had kind of a similar housing. But the one cool thing about this picture is, man, look at the size of that thing compared to these two girls. I mean, either these are really two small women, petite women, or these sirens are much larger than I thought they were. I kind of see them mostly from a vantage point from really low, looking up at them high on a pole. So it's really hard to get an idea of scale in that sense. So yeah, I guess these things are bigger than I thought. Anyway, so just 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the first siren was put into place, and it was on top of a traffic signal at the corner of 2nd and Hill Street. Here, I got a photo here. We can see it. And now 2nd and Hill is located over near the 2nd Street Tunnel, which is still there today. And if you look in the back of this photograph, I'll put it up full screen, you'll see there's a little rise of the street that's on the side of 2nd and on Hill right there. And if you watch my day tripping videos, this would be downtown Los Angeles Walk 3, kind of between Pershing Square and just down the street really from the Angel's Flight, just east of Angel's Flight or northeast of Angel's Flight is where you'd find this if you want to go add this to that trip. Anyway, so the first signal was put it on 2nd and Hill Street, and more would have follow. So this would have been the first initial stage of the civil defense siren system would have been on these traffic lights. So in a January 17th, 1942 story in the Los Angeles Times, they wrote, as the sirens were going up, they wrote, "Any resident of Los Angeles who has forgotten that the nation is at war will awaken with the start soon when the city tests its air raid alarms." Which is a weird thing to think. January 17th, they're rating the nation has forgotten that they're at war. It's an odd thing to write, but it makes sense if you kind of do a little bit of study, like a little bit of research. So Pearl Harbor was December 7th. Between about December 17th and December 20th, and like that week right there, there were about five Japanese submarines patrolling up and down the West Coast, and they attacked a couple of ships, and they sank a couple, they killed a couple of people, but by December 20th, they were done with that tour, or that, I guess, campaign, and they had gone back to, I guess, Japan to refuel and resupply. So this is January 17th. It's been a month and nothing has happened. It's now, think about human nature. Okay, yeah, it's a big thing. It's a war, but it's not happening right there. You're not being attacked now. You're reading the newspapers about everything going on, but you're not seeing it in your backyard. And I guess people just, it's human nature. You start getting complacent. I know with all the COVID-19 stuff going on right now, everybody's going out. It's been 7 weeks, about the same time, and it's doesn't have the same sense of urgency or threat that it did 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. So I can kind of understand it. So about a month later, after the sirens were put in, well, January 17th. Yeah, January, February. Yep. So almost about a month and a half later, about 6 weeks later, the sirens went off for real. This was the only time in the U.S., I believe, that the air raid sirens were activated for an actual threat, and our air raid guns and anti-aircraft guns and installations actually fired at an actual threat, which may or may not have existed at the time, which is known as the Great Los Angeles Air Raid. I'm not going to get too much into that because there are so many great videos out there, and just Google it, do a YouTube search, and you'll find a ton of videos on the air raid. It's a huge thing with UFO enthusiasts that they were firing at a UFO that came down, and I gotta believe if it was, they were either joyriding, enjoying dodging these shells, or they were just terrified and got out of there and haven't been back since. But this all happened at the wee hours of February 25th. 1942, this all happened. So according to the article, it says the sirens wailed for about an hour, and 1,430 shells were fired at the supposed intruder. 5 people died, 3 in car crashes and 2 of heart attacks, and scores were injured during the blackout. So Yeah, I interviewed a gentleman once who talked about driving at this time, and his car, the fragments of the anti-aircraft shells falling down around him, because when you fire these guns, they fired like a bullet, and that bullet exploded in the air, which was called flak, and the whole thing was like kind of like a depth charge. You weren't going to hit the plane with this little bullet. You were going to hit it with all the shrapnel flying out. It was going to puncture the plane and hopefully do enough damage so you either killed the people inside or you damaged the plane enough so it would crash or explode. And that has to come down, gravity, so all those shells are raining down over the city. So the city wasn't being bombed, but it was being rained on by shrapnel, which damaged cars, damaged houses, and luckily it didn't hit anybody that we know of. But yeah, it was a terrifying event. The only thing I'll go into now is like the mentality of this whole thing. So what happened between January 17th, where the newspaper was saying we're going to remind people that they're at war by setting off these sirens, and February 25th, a month later, a little over a month later, where people are freaking out, shooting at the sky at something that doesn't exist, or an enemy that doesn't exist. Well, about 2 days before that, on February 23rd, one of the Japanese submarines returned. And this is one of those, to me, funny war stories where this guy returned. I think it was sub 17, I want to call it. He returned, and I can't remember the name of the guy. I used to know off the top of my head. If I'll put it down here when I edit the video. So the submarine captain returns, and he ends up shooting up what was known as the Elwood oil refinery in Goleta. He didn't hit any of the oil refineries. He did really minimal damage. The story goes that he, before the war, he was the captain of an oil tanker for Japan, and he had been at Goleta, the oil field, and he had fallen down into a patch of cactus, and the workers had seen him and they laughed at him. And being Japanese, he was dishonored. The cactus had dishonored him. So he came back during the war with a submarine with guns and decided to shoot up the cactus patch to regain his honor. That's one of the stories that are going around or that's out there as to why he missed, or his firing on the oil field was so terrible, was that he wasn't aiming at it. So anyway, there's an attack. Finally, this attack occurs. The Japanese are firing guns and bombing the coastline. People were terrified. Any point right now, the Japanese entire Air Force and Navy is going to show up, and they are going to land and attack the West Coast. This was the mentality going on February 25th because of what happened on February 23rd. So I can't blame them too much for the attack, but as far as the civil defense system goes, and this video, because I think I've gotten slightly off topic, that I believe is the only time the civil defense system was activated for an actual attack, and the only time in the U.S. that the anti-aircraft guns were fired against a threat. So I guess it worked. I mean, nobody was hurt, so they went and they found shelter, and it worked. But I gotta believe it really probably changed the mentality of people after that. They were going to pay attention to this thing. I want to reiterate, I think the fact that nobody was hurt during that event shows how well the system worked. So moving on. So at the time, those sirens we would have heard would have probably been the Chrysler, this big engine of a siren here, the Model 7s and the Model A's, and a couple of others which off the top of my head I don't know, but I'm sure you guys will remind me. And one day I'll be a pro at all this. I'll be as knowledgeable as I could possibly be. Because I am reading the comments, and I am trying to learn this stuff, and I do find it fascinating. So, continuing on. Anyway, so the next time the sirens ran out after February 25th, for reasons that weren't a test, was on August 14th, 1945, and that was VJ Day. Victory Japan, which was essentially the end of World War II. And the sirens went off, and it was a celebration. Everybody ran out on the streets, and they were partying. And the sirens, it was a happy occasion. Whereas the sirens in the past had been a test for a possible attack, or going off for a possible attack. Now it was a celebration like the 4th of July, setting sirens off and car alarms and stuff. And everybody I talked to said, honestly, they have a hard time describing it. They just said it was such a great feeling, such a great event, and having that and people screaming and the sirens going off, that must have really been an awesome experience that I don't know if we will ever experience that again. I think that was a once in a lifetime event that only happened in that lifetime. Yeah, so I don't think we're ever going to experience something like that again. But that was the last time the World War II system of sirens went off. So after that, the sirens were they were switched off. They were deactivated. There was really no need for them. It was a post-war. The Cold War really hadn't started yet. Things were warming up and brewing, and that gets into the next phase of the civil defense system.